Meeting of the Mid-Continent Public Library Finance and Audit Committee. This is the regular meeting of the committee, and we have a rather full agenda. So we'll have a roll call. I believe everyone is here except
Michelle.
who's missing?
Michelle.
Michelle is missing, and she'll be on later. Is that right? So otherwise, we have a full quorum.
Yeah, and I think Brian is producing for us. So Brian, when you see Michelle come on, please let us know.
Yeah, I'll do that, Steve. Thanks.
Yep.
Okay, great.
Right.
All right, so the first item of business is 3.1, and that's the approval of the agenda. So is everyone seen the agenda and have an opportunity to consider it?
Move approval.
Been moved, second?
Second.
Been moved and seconded to approve the agenda. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Chairman votes aye. Okay, the minutes of September 21st, 2021. We had sort of a little reprieve after the budget, I guess, and didn't have a meeting.
Right until the audit.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So we have the minutes of September 21st before us, and I hope you've had an opportunity. We'll take a moment or two just for you to review those quickly and see if there are any changes necessary or additions. Okay, hearing none, we'll accept a motion for approval of the minutes. So it's been moved. Second? Oh, Michelle, are you online?
So this is Joycelyn. Hi, John.
Oh, Joycelyn. Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. It's been moved and seconded to approve the minutes of September 21st, 2021. All in favor, say aye.
Hi.
I want to abstain because I wasn't on the committee at that time.
Oh, okay. You may.
Okay. I normally don't abstain.
Welcome. Welcome to the committee. Okay. Where were we? I lost track of where we were.
Call.
5.1.
We're calling to vote. Yes. Is there a vote to approve the minutes?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
So we had all the ayes.
Yes.
You didn't call nays yet.
Huh?
There
You
are
didn't call it nays yet, but
you called ayes.
No, yes.
You need to
Okay.
call
Are
nays.
there any? Yes. Hearing none, the minutes are approved. Unassigned fund balance transfer. No, I'm sorry, I skipped one. The capital plan review. That's, I guess, the main item on our agenda this time, and it relates to Proposition L and the wonderful money that the taxpayers provided us to build new libraries and remodel libraries and make them modern. And we've gone a long way with that. We've done an amazing amount of work in 6 years' time, which is just, when we started out on this, we said we wanted it done in 6 years. I frankly didn't think it would be possible to do that. It has been done. It will be done in that period of time. And I think it's incredible that was able to be done. Of course, there are changes that take place along the way. You can't do a 6-year plan and not have some changes as time goes along. We have had some of those. We've had some additions to our remodeling projects. We've had some changes in the approach to some of the libraries where that required additional property to be bought and in some cases sold. So there were a number of changes, both up and down. And I think the committee feels that we should have a very thorough review at this point of the amount of capital work that's left to be done, the amount of work that has been done, the changes that have taken place, and how they balance out. I believe they do, but I think it's incumbent upon us to be sure that we're within our budget and are not borrowing from the future in terms of capital was not included in our proposition now. So with that sort of general introduction, I'll ask Steve to review this. We have a sheet before us that I think attempts to do that, and we want to make sure that we understand this and that we have ample time to ask questions about it if there are any questions concerning our balance of money. Okay, Steve?
Right,
Turn it over to you.
one of the things I want to do initially, and actually this is something, sort of getting into the practice for two purposes of setting the stage a little bit, talking a little bit more sort of to jumping right into topics, talking a little bit about how we got here. In part because all of our meetings are being recorded now, and anybody at any time could jump in and start viewing our conversations. And so you don't want them to start in the middle of the conversation, if you will. Second thing, of course, is with the board composition. Although this committee is particularly tenured compared to a lot of them, a lot of our board members weren't there the 6 years ago that John was talking about. So if we can go to the PowerPoint on the capital projects and capital funds. That's it. And next slide, please. I really just want to start off by defining what is the capital projects fund? What is this fund that we speak of? It really is much like a savings account. It is meant to pay for one-time expenses as opposed to ongoing annual or monthly expenses. It's allocated by the board from a specific budget outside the operating budget. So we do all this budgeting work that we talk about every year, but this actually has a separate budget that's outside, tends to be sort of one-time hits as opposed to a long budgeting process like we do for the operating budget. It's frequently thought of as a building fund because the capital improvement and replacement project is funded from this source. But even though it is thought of as a building fund, it can be used for purposes other than construction. So for example, in 2004, we used funds from the capital projects fund to fund the migration from our legacy automation system to our new automation system. Back in 2004. We also funded building maintenance on an ongoing basis from 2004 to 2014 from this fund, as opposed to new construction. So it can be used for other things, but sort of the earmark or the benchmark idea has been that this is a fund that we use for one-time expenses. So we wouldn't tap the capital projects fund for monthly salaries, for example, ongoing expense. The other thing is, so we have a fund. So where do the resources come from for the fund? It mostly comes from an annual direction from the board. So sometimes there's a plan transfer, and we'll get to that in just a little bit. Most years, there's a transfer of revenues over expenses following the final audited financial statements. So it's we didn't spend all 10. We spent all but 2% of our office supplies. So what do we do with those office supplies? Instead of encouraging a use it or lose it mentality amongst our staff, where it could end up being wasteful spending because they're just afraid of leaving money in the account, what we do is we encourage people to spend wisely whatever's left over, revenues over expenses is what that's called, we transfer into this fund. And that's how the fund, for the most part, is resourced. But there are other resources. Interest income, sale of large assets like buildings and land, proceeds from the COP bond are also setting in there. And so as of September 30, and if you actually look at the combined balance sheet that was in the board documents, the balance of the capital project fund was $44.4 million. Like you can see. And we update that every month, and you can track that in that document. So if we go to the next slide, please. So we talked about the capital project fund, and I touched on the capital improvement and replacement plan. So what is the capital improvement and replacement plan? And that is a plan that was put together in 2014, and is an important guiding document and guiding principle for the capital, for the Proposition L campaign of 2016. As it really started as a building assessment exercise, but it really began to get us to understand what we needed to do in terms of capital investment. When we finished up that plan, there were hard construction costs identified at $84 million. And that became the number that we talked about a lot during the campaign. When we actually went in and, after the campaign was over and we started looking at hard costs, soft costs, property acquisition, things like that, the total number for the capital improvement plan was $113 million. And then we got to the point at that juncture where the board and the committees discussed how we want to actually do this. Do we want to employ a pay-as-you-go strategy? Do we want to borrow funds in order to do this? And ultimately what was decided was to combat construction inflation, to address some of the more pressing needs. The board elected to accelerate the plan using all of the fund balance that was currently in the capital projects fund and to borrow funds to allow us to get to that $113 million, as opposed to employing a pay-as-you-go strategy. And just as a brief aside before we go to the next slide, I unearthed all of those old presentations that we did back then. And that was an interesting jaunt through memory lane. The one real thing that I remember from that is that if we were going to employ a pay-as-you-go strategy, according to J.E. Dunn, it was going to take us about 24 years to do it, and it was going to cost us about $30 or $40 million more to do it than financing it. So, okay, so next slide, please. So now what I thought I'd do is we talk a little bit about how this fund is sourced and where the money's come from, and just sort of highlight some of those over the last few years. So, as I mentioned, sort of the most common way, it's not the biggest way that money gets into the fund, but the most common way is the transfer to the capital fund, most usually due to revenues over expenses. And so, so these are the last few years of those transfers. In 2016, for fiscal year 14-15, it was about $700,000. And as you can see, those first 2 years, under $1 million. I mean, this really is, when you're dealing with a multi-million-dollar budget like we do, and you don't want to overspend accounts and you don't want to radically underspend an account, I mean, coming in $7,000 or $700,000, $800,000 is not terribly off the mark. And those were the revenues over expenses amounts. In 2018, this is when we really started to see the proceeds of Proposition L come in. And the transfer that year was $8.6 million. Now, that sounds like a lot, but $8.6 million, 8 of that $8.6 million was a planned transfer. So the idea was, we know we're getting a bunch of new money for the first time this year, and we're going to immediately send 8 million of it into the capital projects fund to help make up that difference between the fund balance, the amount of money we borrowed to get to that, to get to the full funding of the capital projects fund. In November of 2019, right before COVID, for the 18-19 year, we transferred $4.5 million. And again, $3 million of that was planned. So it's that idea that there was a gap between the full funding of the capital fund and the fund balance and the COPS. We still needed to come up with like another $10 million or so. And so there was planned transfers to make up that difference.
COPS is certificates
of participation.
So
Thank
people
you.
don't think we're talking about law enforcement.
Yeah, thank you.
Bonds.
And so so then things get a little weird because of COVID. But in April of normally in the fall of 2020, we would have looked to have done another revenue over expenses transfer or something like that. But we decided to keep money where it was, keep it liquid. We didn't know what was going to happen in terms of revenues and things like that. So we kind of sat on our hands. So a year later in 2021, we transferred $5.5 million into the capital project fund. $4 million of it essentially was planned. 3 million of it essentially was planned. 1 million of it was to have happened in the year that just ended. And then in 2019, 2020, we were supposed to transfer 2 million, but chose not to for liquidity purposes. And as it turned out, we didn't need to, so we transferred all of that. Ended up transferring 1.2 million for technology expenses, 275,000 for appropriate expenses at the Woodneath project, and then 4 million as part of what was deferred plus part of what was the original plan for 2021. And if the committee decides, the next agenda item is to approve a transfer. Again, revenues over expenses at the end of the year, we were setting with $1,035,000. And so we would take that out of the operating fund and move that into the capital projects fund. But that's pending. That actually hasn't happened yet. Okay, so next slide, please. So the next slide, if you remember, another source of revenues or resources is the sale of surplus buildings and property. And we do sell small surplus items like you may know that we have an annual auction. We sell things like used office chairs and things like that that aren't really capitalized. And so that's not what we're talking about here. Usually the stuff that comes into this fund or the resources that come from this fund are larger capitalized assets like buildings or land. Even vehicles. Vehicles tend to have such a small resale value that we tend to use those as trade-in as opposed to even those going back into this. So recent transactions here. Liberty Building was $750,000. That was sold and revenues put into the capital project fund. Grain Valley.
It was sold to the
Liberty
School District of Liberty.
Correct. Grain Valley was actually sold to a church, a startup church. They actually put together a rent-to-own scenario for us. And this was back, Quan, when did we do that? Was that 2014, 2015?
4 years ago.
Yeah. It's about 4 or 5 years ago. But the transaction now has completely closed. And so this small church now owns our old building, and we received about $100,000 in revenue for that. Surplus land in Smithville. So some of you might remember we bought 10 acres of property in Smithville to build the Smithville branch. Knew we didn't need 10 acres, but the property owner wouldn't sell less than 10 acres. And so the idea was always to buy that and sell off the surplus. And so we sold off the surplus land in Smithville for $815,000, and that still does come up from time to time because they're part of that sale. There was a pledge for charitable donation, which separate and apart from this, kind of going into the Wood Needs Fund. But Quan, the 815, did that include the charitable donation, or that's separate?
That's just the net proceeds.
Net proceeds. Thank you. And then the other one, the last one we have here was the sale of the Smithville and Boardwalk properties, which were assessed at $1.5 million, but we actually essentially used those as a trade. So we traded those two properties. No cash really actually ended up changing hands, but if they had, Bill Mann would have written us the check for $1.5 million, and we would have immediately countersigned it and handed it back to him to purchase the property at Green Hills. That process has occurred several times in the past, where essentially we used previous properties, previously abandoned properties to buy new sites. So those are transactions that have happened recently. Other transactions that have happened or that could happen, property that we own that are surplus. The Harvey Jones building, which basically surrounds the North Independence, or surrounded by the North Independence property. I would always advise against selling it simply because it's, when you have an independent entity and it's completely surrounded by us, it just makes it challenging. But the current Jackson County GIS for taxing purposes says that building's worth $250,000. Maze Road, which is it's a vacant lot next door to us this direction, GIS says is worth $98,000. We actually bought that, I think, for $36,000. So it's actually appreciated quite a bit, at least according to the county. And then the Red Bridge branch is also, the GIS claims that it's worth about $1 million.
So that gives it the way that's on there, it shows we have a choice of either 100,000 or $1 million, right? Is that?
Yeah, it's short of zero. Good point, John.
So it's $1 million.
It's $1 million. Yeah, it's actually $1 million is what the Red Bridge is what the Jackson County GIS says that building is worth. So
Can I ask a question before we go on? So in the Smithville, we don't have any additional land because the purchase acquired everything that we didn't need. Is the whole tract sold?
Quan, do you recall, did we sell everything south of Richardson Road, or was it just all of it?
Yeah, I think. all-
Okay, yeah, but the property where the library itself sits
Right.
is still very spacious. I mean, there's room
Right.
for us to
We have no additional land holdings at Smithfield.
at Smithville, correct?
Okay. And the Smithfield at the bottom was the old branch.
The old branch, correct?
Okay,
Correct.
thank you.
And so one thing that you'll see, and I know one of these charts actually shows, I did the one on when we talk about the capital expenses in a couple of slides, that there was anticipation of sale of these properties to help offset the cost of the capital plan. So when we're selling some of these buildings, it's not all found money. Some of it was kind of accounted for. We'll show you that in the next couple of slides. So the next slide is capital plan interest income, which isn't a lot, but certainly worth talking about. So unlike the operating fund, funds in the capital projects funds can be invested for longer than 1 year. By law, anything that's in the operating fund, we can only invest it for 1 year's time. But in the capital project fund, in fact, we have done this where we've invested it for 5 years because we didn't have an immediate need for it. Longer investments yield better returns. And so we've done that sometimes. But we are still limited to instruments where the principal cannot be lost. So think bonds, certificates of deposit, but not stocks, mutual funds, things like that. We can't invest in, even though we can invest for a longer period of time. Just a quick summary on a couple of the on where we are in terms of investment income. Year to date, realized and unrealized gains on the certificates of deposit bonds. excluding the certificates of deposit bond. So the proceeds that we got from land sales, things like that, is about $250,000, $250,000. But one of the things we did when we received the proceeds from the certificates of participation is that we decided that we could take that money and invest it in a way so that as we were slowly drawing it down, we could maximize the money. And that was in a program called a flexible repurchase, a three-party flexible repurchase agreement. And so if you go back to 2018, when we first established that relationship, the initial projections on the cash flow for the capital projects fund, we thought we might make about $1.5 million in investment for investing the unused funds until we got around to using them. The flexible repurchase was projected to yield about $2.5 million once we actually took in bids and things. So extra $1 million, which is real money. And so felt pretty good about that in general. There were some questions, there were some considerable questions from some of our board members about the process and whether it was legal and whether we were going to lose the money and things like that. But we haven't lost any of the money. And actual returns right now, we have a small account with Bank of Kansas City that holds, it's basically a pass-through fund, but as our funds pass through, it accrues interest. And so since 2008, that Bank of Kansas City fund has yielded $100,000, $110,000. And then Natixis, which is the organization that put together the three-party flexible repurchase agreement, has actually yielded $3.6 million, so well above projections. And this is, I mean, I hate to say it this way, but this is found money. I mean, this was stuff that we didn't necessarily expect to have, but has been much better return. If we go to the next slide, this is where the rubber really kind of begins to meet the road. So this slide actually talks through assumptions, what we spent, what's left to be spent, et cetera. So if we go up to, at the very top, funding sources, and again, we've talked about those same old funding sources. So the very first line is certificate of participation, $80 million. And then the capital project fund reserve. So basically what was in the fund for us to spend, the fund balance when we started, $17 million. And then the next was the taxes and operating fund transfers. So this, you know, when I kept saying there were planned transfers, these are accounting for those planned transfers. And then, and that was listed at $9 million. And then property disposal. So again, like I was talking about before, that the sale of the property was kind of baked into this a little bit. So $5 million there. And then general fund reserve. And so this is essentially the revenues over expenses transfer, part of the transfer that we were assuming would probably still happen, just because we're conservative and frugal. And so we assumed that there would be some money which gives us $114.7 million. And that's the number. That number should ring a bell with Brent. It's the number that we always have on the placemat. Should sound familiar to John as members of the capital, as the building committee. So then when you go down to expenditures, you begin to see how we spent it. So work packages that we spent $56 million, design FF&E, so soft cost property acquisitions. And so we can see year to date as of the end of the fiscal year, and then what we've done so far this fiscal year and what was budgeted, getting us to our remaining amount, which is $9.9 million. And so, so then if you actually look at the very, very bottom, if you add up everything that we need, hard cost, soft cost, land acquisitions, all of that, we need about $38.9 million to complete the capital plan as we've discussed. We have, Quan has sort of put a little firewall in there and says that there's $40 million available to complete the plan. And as you might remember from the first slide, I think it was the first slide, the actual fund balance in the capital projects fund right now is $44.4 million. So we, the extra $4 million is for, if you remember, we transferred $1 million for technology. There's an allocation for a new reading rocket that's in there. I mean, so there's some additional funding.
Historical home.
And historical home, right? Woodneath, there's also funding for Woodneath that's part of that fund balance. So that's the difference between the $4 million and the $44 million that's setting in that reserve fund. And so before going to the next slide, and I think this is kind of a good point to just sort of pause for a second. But this is sort of the important bottom line. You know, we've been targeting a certain number for the capital project fund. We have the resources to meet that need. And as the chair of the building committee, or co-chair of the building committee will tell you, we haven't been trimming project scope. In fact, if anything, we've been increasing project scope, and we are still in good shape. So yeah, let's pause for a second.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to mention that nowhere in this is included the fundraising for the Woodneath property, which I think is very important to understand. That the amount, I don't have the exact amount, but it's near $4 million. Is that correct? Through various programs and philanthropy, we were able to raise that. I don't have the.
Yeah, it's a little smaller. The total campaign was about 3, wasn't it?
3.4, maybe.
I don't remember exactly, but
yeah. But anyway, most of that has been, almost all of that has been, 100% of that, as far as I know, has been covered.
There's a little bit that was covered by Mid-Continent. So what we said is that we didn't want to use tax funds for the restoration of the house and things like that. But when it comes to things like office furniture, whether we're in the house or not in the house, we're going to need office furniture. And if we had to vacate the house, we would take the office furniture with us. And so we paid for office furniture, for example, out of tax funds.
Well, but we also got a grant from the Kaufman Foundation for the office furniture.
That's true. That's true. You are right. That was one that I had lined up in case that didn't happen. But yes, you are right. I misspoke.
Yeah.
I did misspeak. But there was a handful of things like that. Some of the some of the engineering and things like that, I think we paid for just because we had keep the ball rolling and it was just easier to do. So
yeah, there were some of
but yeah, it's nominal. You're right, John. It's nominal.
Well, and then I think the next step, if there are no questions there, are there questions? Yeah, Brent?
Brent Schummer, excellent presentation. You know, in some ways, even when you've been here for some time, you know, you're in the moment and making a decision in the moment and seeing it really over time. I'm going to reflect back when John and I came onto the board, there was a significant capital fund reserve. And, you know, the question was raised at that time, why have that if there wasn't a plan for that? And so that's kind of got us going down this sort of path, and we've really implemented an aggressive, ambitious plan. So I'm going to pause on the sheet that's on the screen. I don't see on the expenditure side interest payments for the bonds. And I'm not so sure I see on the revenue side the earnings from the Nexus, you know, and things like that. So I think that they may show up here in this larger placemat, but the document in front of us kind of suggests is that we're able to borrow money at zero interest rate. And so
You're right. It's not actually because the payment of the bond is actually not done through the capital project fund. It's done through a different fund.
A special fund.
A special fund, right. And so
Okay.
it actually shows up someplace else.
And some of the expenditures are not included here. For example, moving and storage, those are paid by the interest from the bond.
I misspoke in an over anxious moment in the morning, but this is really important because it shows us is that we've kind of managed our resources. We've managed the projects. If the projects have gotten larger, it was a thoughtful, intentional discussion about we're going to not touch this building for another 20 or 25 years, and shouldn't we be doing it at the time that we're on the side? So. As sitting on the other side of chairing the building committee and creating the demand for the resources, it's comforting to sit here with my colleagues and see is that the available resources are there to complete the program.
And that we were mindful of some of the things that were of concern to some members at the time this all took place. And that is that we would have money to repair and take care of on an ongoing basis these new properties. Of course, obviously, in the first year or two, you wouldn't expect to have very many capital repairs to make to these properties, but there will be some, and then there will be an increasing amount as the properties age.
Well, and frankly, John,
We're at that. We've been mindful of that and have managed toward that.
yeah, and frankly, one of the bigger concerns early in this process was something that we're all familiar with. Because we all live in school districts and we've all seen the thing where a school district will pass a bond and say, you know, we've got this plan to do 5 buildings. And by the time they get to the end, it's like, oops, we only got 3 done. And now we need to do more bond proceeds. And so that didn't happen.
Right.
Not only is there, and we're going to get to what you're talking about the maintenance plan too, but not only is there a long-term maintenance plan, but we are fulfilling the promise of what we promised the taxpayers. It's not like we're having to decrease the scope of all of our buildings by 75%.
Right. And I'm sure you're going to cover this, but another part of it is that we have at least 3 items that we have, you know, that have been proposed, that we've discussed in great detail, one committee or another and the whole board. And they're concerning Grain Valley and what are the other 2 that I'm thinking of? The changes to the
Riverside.
Riverside's the big one.
Yeah, Riverside's the big one.
Riverside and sort of in the rear view, Riverside's still ahead. In the rear view mirror, Grandview is the big one that we really did talk a lot about changing scope. And we changed scope to the tune of a couple $1 million in that one. And then Redbridge, of course, was another one. It's sort of in the rearview mirror that we really did change scope and direction. But it isn't, well, I mean, there's still funding to do East Independence, which is still, you know, to be considered. There's still funding to do Grain Valley, which is you know underway. So even though we changed scope.
Yeah. Okay. All right. That's what I wanted to make sure that we we could account for those changes that we've been talking about and make sure that we have the dollars to act on the negotiations that we've had with these various cities about changes. Okay,
Right. So,
any other questions?
So John, if I may, this is Joycelyn.
Yes,
I
Joyce.
wanted to really say that was an excellent presentation. I agree with Brent on that. And to further highlight the point that Mr. Potter brought up is it was the intent at the beginning of this to really fulfill the promise that we were making to all, whether it was at the beginning of the process or at the end of the process, that we would realize the vision that each community gave to us, because we went around and we talked to everybody in the community about what their needs were, and these buildings and properties and programming and structures were structured around those needs. So we wanted to make sure that the process was protected so that even the projects at the tail end would have the funding available to meet that need. And I commend the building committee, staff, and the finance committee in really doing all that was needed to make sure that vision came true. So thank you.
Thank you for the comment. Other questions? Ron?
so just two other things real quickly then. If we go to the next slide, this is a snapshot of what you have in front of you, the big chart that's in front of you. And this is a tool that Juan and I put together really during the Proposition L campaign. And Jim Staley's always interested in this, so he always sets in these meetings too, whenever Quan and I are working on this. This spreadsheet was originally set up as a 25-year spread. Now, honestly, once you start getting out beyond 4 or 5 years into the future, you may as well throw darts at a dartboard, but I mean, you may be just as accurate. But the point is, we're going through the process every year where we're trying to figure out what exactly is it going to look like for us to meet the different needs that we have in our community. We only update this once a year, right at the beginning of budget time. And so, in fact, you'll notice that the 2021, which is essentially finished, is still the column up at the top says estimate, because we only update it once a year, and we haven't updated it because we usually do it right before the budget. But it is still good ballpark numbers. And so basically, and there are a couple of columns here that are hidden that go back to 2016. But what you can see in here, and to Brent's point about 4 lines down, you can see transfer to debt service fund. That's where that comes from, because we actually pay the debt service out of every year's operations. And so what you end up seeing here is our tax revenue, other revenues that come in, and then we take out any planned transfers to the capital projects fund, any transfer to the debt service fund to make sure we're paying our mortgage. And then at the end, that tells us how much money we have to spend on the annual operations. In terms of annual operations, we're still sort of holding to those heuristics, the benchmarks of no more than 60% for personnel and 22%, 18% for overhead and 22% for materials. So that's sort of our benchmark for that, and holding to that all the way through, essentially all the way through to the end of the period. We do project revenue increases, but they're very conservative. I mean, it's usually only like 1% or so. I mean, we tend to be very conservative on that. And then the other thing that you'll notice as you go down to the bottom is the ending unassigned operating fund balance, which needs to be higher than 42%, so that we don't have a liquidity situation at the end of our fiscal year. So we don't have to borrow money in November and December to make sure, before new revenues come in. And so as you can see, that number, it actually gets embarrassingly high toward the end. But again, the further you get out on this, the less accurate it truly is. Then if you go down below, you sort of in the blue area, this is when we start talking about the capital projects fund. Within the capital projects fund, you can see that the transfer in, the bond, any interest that gets put in, and you can see it tends to be pretty conservative later in because we just don't have that high a fund balance. And so we've got our total revenues and then our capital expenses, and so this shows us the capital projects fund and where we are in terms of payments. So if you move forward down the line, and I think there's one really important thing to notice here is that when you get to about year 24, 25, you'll see that we start transferring in $1.5 million for a while, plan transfers in. And then in capital expenditures, you can see $200,000 in expense. And then there's another 200,000, 200,000, 200,000, million, 2 million. What this line is showing is what John was just talking about, the maintenance of the buildings. And so we're planning, this is showing planned maintenance of the buildings. And so why $200,000 these next 4 years or so? This really captures the buildings that were only touched lightly during the capital plan, but were completely replaced before the capital plan. Smithville, North Independence, the main part of the Midwest Genealogy Center. They're going to have, those are the 4 big. And so they're going to have some maintenance expenses until we actually get into there. And then in 2028, which is 10 years from when we started the capital plan, we start seeing $1 million investments and then later $2 million investments in the maintenance of the building. We had a full-blown capital replacement plan that ran for 10 years from 2004 to 2014. And that included replacing roofs, carpet, updating the asphalt, all those things that were terrible when you two guys got on the board. And so Joycelyn, when Joycelyn got on the board, what I did is Jake's been working on doing a new version of that project, but he's still doing his day job, which is finishing up the capital plan. And so what we've done for planning purposes is took that 2004 report, added construction inflation, made sure that it looked reasonable. And basically what it's suggesting is that it's going to cost us about $9.5 million to do a 10-year maintenance plan on our new buildings starting in 2028. And so if you start looking at this money, and actually if we go to the next slide, it kind of tells us, kind of summarized. So that third bullet point, I think, is probably the real important one. As planned in 2023, we start to accumulate new funds into the capital project fund to start a maintenance plan that will start in 2028. And then, of course, we start spending about $200,000 a year for those buildings that are sort of pre-capital plan: Smithville, North Independence, MGC, and Woodby. And then our current estimate is that 10-year plan starting in 2028 will cost about $9.5 million. A lot more work to do to get that a lot more precise. But if we are able to allocate, that we'll be able to allocate about $9 million between now and 2028, so that we can start spending that $1 million annually, so that we can keep up the appearances in the facilities that we've just built or remodeled. But I think the important thing, the thing that I always want to underscore about that point is that in order for all this stuff to talk about, all the stuff I'm talking about to work, we need to start saving today in order for it to work. So yes, we do have a positive revenues over expenses situation. There could be an argument that, we've got more money than we actually need today, but we're going to need it in 10 years. And so my argument would be once, that we've got an idea that this capital plan is going to cost, or that this maintenance plan is going to cost about $9.5 million. We start putting the money away now to make sure that we can maintain our buildings, and also just the other revenues over expenses, saving for a rainy day in case we need to replace a computer or some unforeseen expense that we don't know about. And we should be able to fulfill this 25-year plan. And so as you actually go all the way through this, you can also see that the 25-year plan shows when we pay off our bonds, when we start having positive cash, well, we always have positive cash flow, but generally speaking, showing that by the time we get to 2041, 42, we're still in a positive situation. So, I mean, those of you who remembered seeing me during Proposition L, and even though Ron wasn't on the board, he saw me talking during Proposition L. And, one of the things I kept telling people is that if we pass this, it's going to be highly unlikely that we're going to be going to the voters anytime in the near future. And this is why I was saying that, because as you see the way that we're managing the cash flow, with nothing major unforeseen, we're going to be able to allocate 60% of our revenue-ish to personnel, 20+% for materials, around 18 to 20% for overhead, pay off our bonds, maintain our buildings, and still be in the black. And that's what this experiment is all about. And that's really what it is. It's an experiment that makes sure that Quan and I, while we're looking right in front of us, we're also looking down the road to make sure that we're not being penny wise and pound foolish. So that concludes this. That's all I have to say. So I am happy to entertain more questions, more clarification, explanation.
Steve, I just want to, is the $9.5 million, is that based on folks like Jay and J10 getting together and guessing what's going to fall apart? It's more basic, carpentry and roofing and stuff like that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, understanding that we put a certain type of HVAC system in our buildings, it only has a 20-year life,
Right.
Those sorts of things. Exactly.
Just normal obsolescence and,
Right. Carpet will only last for so long.
Gotcha.
That's, and like I said, our sort of thumbnail approach to this is based on a plan that we executed and then adjusted for inflation.
Gotcha.
So,
And also, I'm noticing here that the tax revenues, they seem to be awfully shy of what I think we were going to come in like awfully shy. And then also too, I was wondering on
no, you're right.
the personnel, it seems like the increases are like about 2% or something. And I think in terms of, or a better word, fairness or whatever, wouldn't there necessarily be more increases over time for regular raises and things like that?
There could be. I mean, what our run rate though for several years has been about 2% of total.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. And you're right. I mean, we tend to underestimate our tax revenue. Because I mean, it's the right thing to do. I mean, you don't want to budget based on $10 million more dollars than you actually get. But we always adjust accordingly. I mean, ultimately, the budget that we put forward is always based on projection. But Quan, that number is about right. It's about 2% total personnel, isn't it? Personnel inflation.
Yeah,
Ballpark.
because we have the number of staff that reduced.
Yeah, I mean, that is a good point. I mean, one of the things, and Brent, John, Joycelyn will remember this, we really have been working at trying to have less better paid and better educated staff. So at one point, we had almost 1,200 staff members, but they were extremely low paid.
Gotcha.
And so we've been decreasing, and automation has changed some of that too. And there are several other things that have approached that. But yeah, we are, this does take into account the issues you're talking about.
Yeah, and by and large for what I call licensed staff, the librarians, we've tried the efficiencies that we've been able to put into place, the various machines to mention 2 or 3 of those, Steve, that we've put in place.
Yeah, I mean, we've done actually, the way that we process our requests was incredibly increased in terms of efficiency. So we did things like we use a special label stock and a special printer that allows us to actually speed up our delivery time and decrease our touches in terms of lean. And we also float our collection. So that means, I use Ron as an example, as a Northlander. You might check out a book at Antioch, but return it at Riverside.
Sure.
So instead of us actually bringing that book, picking it up at Riverside, bringing it here, sorting it, and taking it back to Antioch, we just put it on the shelf at Riverside. And it just floats to where people want it or where people return it. Doing both of those things ended up saving in total pretty close to $1 million annually in terms of operations. And so some of it's machinery, some of it's processes, and we're always looking for ways to approach that. So
Yeah, the check-in, check-out process.
Yes,
has been
the
so
automated.
incredibly automated, and but that hasn't caused us to have fewer staff because we've tried to give the staff the freedom to deal with customers and talk to them and be available to them.
Right. So instead of sitting at a service desk and being a cashier, essentially,
Right.
we've got the self-check machines where it's still 60-70% of our people use those without staff interaction. The other 30 to 40% are people who need staff interaction. And so those folks can focus on those people as opposed to trying to rush them through quickly because there's a big line. Yeah, it's worked tremendously. And it's a big win-win because instead of having people, having low paid cashiers, essentially, we have people who can do more story times or do more business outreach or whatever.
Or just general assistance.
Or general
People who come
assistance,
in
yeah.
and need.
Because they're not tethered to the desk. They can get out.
Right.
Yes. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had one of the shocking moments I recall decades ago when attached to a pencil in the library was a little, sort of like a stamp.
Yeah.
It removable dates and numbers so they
Yeah, yeah.
could actually write your name and stamp next to a card.
Right.
And you inside the book would be a pocket that has the date on it for return date inside the card. And it just absolutely, what we have right now is utterly inconceivable, which was 2 generations ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in terms of process, yeah, back in the day, I mean, there used to be a rule in the summer reading program that you had to have a book checked out for at least one day in order to include it in the list. The reason why, because it took us at least 2 days to get a book back on the shelf, and we didn't want people flooding our sort rooms. And in fact, now lots of this stuff's digital. It's not even shelved at all. So.
Okay, I just wanted to highlight one of the lines here, transfer to debt service
Yes.
fund. And that is primarily the amount that will be needed to service the bonds. Because
Correct.
we have to remember, as somebody pointed out earlier, that we borrowed this money in order to get these jobs done. And by doing so, we saved somewhere around, conservatively, I would say, $30 to $40 million by doing so. But we also then are going to have to pay interest on the money that we borrowed for the period of time, a portion of this time shown on here. And if you look at that line, transfer to debt service fund, you will see the amounts roughly that will go into the debt service fund each year up through years
38.
38,
Mhm.
up through 38, yeah. So that would be the time when we would actually pay that off. We do have an opportunity in the contracts that we have to borrow the money to pay it off at an earlier time. And Quan, would you remind us of when that period will occur?
It's a 10-year call.
Yeah, 10 years from
So it'd be
27, 28.
So,
FY 27-28 can be repaid at any point without penalty.
okay, so 27, 28 will be a time that we'll be looking toward to try to see if we can call some of these bonds. We don't have to call them all. We can just call some. Is that right?
I think we have either paid off or continue. We cannot, well, of course, we can make more payments towards the principal. Yes, if that's what you mean, yes.
Right. Yes.
And you could always refinance it too. I mean, now frankly, it's
Yeah.
one of the things Michael Short and I talk about at least once every 6 months, just knowing current market conditions. Would it make sense to just refinance all of this because interest rates as low as they were when we did this, they're even lower now.
Yeah.
But the penalties associated with doing that right now are not favorable. But when we get to 2028, we could theoretically do that. We
Yeah.
could theoretically just refinance the whole thing if interest rates are particularly low, and instead of doing it in 10 years, do it in 5 years, or any number of different options.
But that's something that in every budget from this point forward, it ought to be an issue, an item that's discussed as the budget is prepared, so that we remember that that's the case, and so that we can keep it in mind in terms of planning toward that. I would hope that we would be at a place where we could reduce that time by then. And that might take some special effort on our part beyond what we're doing now, depending upon other things, what happens. If we have a lot more revenue than we anticipated, for example, we might not want to roll all that into the capital fund. We might want to put some of that into the fund to pay off these bonds at an earlier time. So there are lots of things to consider, and we can't sit here today and make decisions about all of those, but we can keep it in mind and pledge to keep it in mind for every budget process, so that we're keenly aware of that opportunity coming up in 27, 28. So,
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
related to that, it's Brett Schoenemeyer. I'd like our financial advisor to come in and kind of walk us through this, and so we understand this in a little sort of detail. Because if you look at it, these are not inconsequential interest payments, 20, 28, like $2 million, $2 million, $2 million. And to the degree, you just see a lot of local governments refinancing their debt, and even if we refinance the balance entirely at a lower interest rate, that still is something that shaving off the number of years on the maturity of the bonds. And so, I've raised this periodically, and I just think it would be good to have our financial advisor come in so we understand it. So to your point is that when the opportunity does present itself, is that we have the resources, are we financially planned in order to make that choice? We don't have to at that point to pay off the principal, but any financial management says the first thing you should do is pay off your credit card, and so bond is our organization's institution's version of what the credit card is. Clearly, we're not paying 18 or 19 or 21%, but the principal still applies.
Yeah, or pay off your house. You pay off your house first.
Yeah, but with that, I think there's a notion among us folks with families, and that's not a good thing to do, because we lose our jobs or whatever. But I think here we do have a more reliable source of income.
Right.
So I think that if we have identifiable known amounts of debt and pretty reasonable, equally known amounts of revenue coming in, I think if there's a surplus built up, of course, paying off the principal is an option, but I think sometimes too, there could be opportunities that could be just really just amazing at that moment. And I think sometimes spending other than reducing debts, maybe, not a bad idea.
To me, it would be helpful to say what is a potential plan? What about what are the limitations based on the bond document? What are the financial?
I guess my thought would be is I think certainly to focus on the amount of the available funds, but I'd be just personally not too comfortable with having a mindset that we have to use it towards principal. I think if we keep it more flexible to see what can we get at that time that could be just a real amazing treasure to add to the whole library system. Because I think the money's going to be coming in. I won't be around that long. The money's going to be coming in to pay off the debt. So, and I think this is distinguishable from like my finances. Absolutely, pay off the mortgage, and absolutely.
And I'm trying to think in a more holistic fashion. Is there a way to reduce the total cost of the borrowing, whether it's debt reduction? Like I'm just looking out, 2020, 23, 24, the unassigned balance is that we're at 63%. And when our policy says we need to be at 50%. So it seems to me is that anything above 50% projects revenue over expenses, and that there really represents some opportunities. And so anyway, I think it would be good just to hear that. We've been very, very, very thoughtful on the building plan and what it is that it looks like. This is really another excellent document about what it is that it looks like. Can we get a concurrent or complementary plan that says, what are the opportunities really around debt structure or bond financing?
But Ron
that
makes,
is a note.
Ron makes an excellent point that it shouldn't be our only focus.
No.
Because we know that we can afford, with some leeway, the amount of debt that we will be paying over this entire period of time up until 2037, 38. And we know we can do that. And so we have to be mindful of obviously saving as much from that as we can. If that means refinancing and so forth, it means refinancing. But we need to also take into account that there might be, in that period of time, there will be other needs and things that will appear that we can't contemplate right now, that will relate to new things that will require new capital money. So, yeah, Quan.
I did some quick calculation. If we want to pay it off early, maybe that's for 8 years from now. It will take about $45 million to pay it off. That will be the debt service balance in 2027. If that's the plan, we need to save maybe $5 or $6 million each year to be able to do that.
Right.
So, my point is, if that's the plan, we need to do something starting next budget year.
We need to start. Yeah, that's right. And we can do that if we're not so totally committed to that we ignore new needs that arise that we can't right now know.
Right. So
That was your point.
Yeah, you have a 5 million or 60 million, that's a chunk.
well, and I don't want to set up a straw man just to knock him down, but I mean, part of my concern has always been that we rush too quickly to pay off the debt, and then we use that money that we're setting aside to maintain our buildings gets put into that fund, and then all of our buildings are falling apart. Okay, so we're debt free, but we've got buckets sitting in the middle of the floor,
Yeah.
and potholes in our parking lot. I mean, that's not what we want either.
So to reclaim my position, I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not saying that we should adopt a policy is that we pay off the debt before we do anything else. I just think it's a choice that when it comes to budgetary time, because I don't want to preclude if there's some new thing, major capital expense that we need to do, but if there's a way to kind of restructure the debt in such a way as that it doesn't impede future choices, but reduces the total cost of borrowing, it's something worth considering.
Yeah, and I think it's a discipline. It's a discipline to ask that question every budget cycle, so that when we go through a budget cycle, we'll be looking at that and wondering what we should do. Is there something new that's occurred that we'd like to handle? There's a couple of projects I can think of right now which are not included in the program, the capital program, but are conceivable that we would want to act on those within the next couple of years. I won't discuss those right here, but there are such projects.
I'm just wanting to understand it a little bit better, what the options and what the choices are. This is not a policy recommendation. It's just more, let's organize the information so as we move forward into upcoming years that we can understand.
We'll invite the representatives from Stiefel who've been advising me and Quan, and just have them walk through, because I think there are options, whether it's making early payments, whether it's refinance. All of those things are things that we can just sort of walk through. I would suggest that it's good to have the conversations and good to make the plans, but with the 10-year call, there's very little we can really do other than plan right now.
Yeah, or other than set aside money. I mean, Quan points out that if we want to maintain that choice, then we have to save toward that. Yeah. But we don't want to save to the point that we say to needs that come to us in 3 years that we don't know about now.
Right.
We don't want to say, well, I'm sorry, we've already committed this to savings for paying off the bonds. I mean, and yet we still have to do some of that. We do have to do some savings if we're going to continue to have that opportunity. And Quan makes a very good point there.
Well, the people who advised us earlier gave us excellent advice and got us $3.8 million in a way that I hadn't kind of anticipated and imagined. I'm going to give them some skill and credit. They might be able to come up with something on the other side of it all that might be to our benefit.
Right, sure, right. Yeah, it's to their interest to come up with that
Yeah.
sort of thing too. You know, that's
Yeah.
another way to look at it.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, and yeah, so we certainly don't want to set aside the opportunity to save a little money on it by refinancing or some such financial technique that will reduce our amounts that we're paying.
Gentlemen,
Yes.
just a quick comment. I agree with all that is being said here. But I also think that by reviewing and creating the plan and revisiting, it create, I mean, 8 to 10 years is a long time from now. Short in terms of history, but a long time in terms of an organization. It's the exercise in and of itself creates the history and lets people understand the thinking that was going on at the time, why we did it that way, why we're planning, why we made the choices. So I would encourage us to go through that exercise, because whether or not we make certain choices is almost secondary to understanding why those choices were made. That's all.
Very good point. We have to stay flexible is what that's all about. And the discipline of that is to do it every year. We go through the same process every year as a part of the budget cycle. And that's good discipline for us to do that. And we can think through these things then as new needs appear. Okay. Thank you, Joycelyn. I appreciate that comment. Michelle, are you online?
Yes, she's on.
Yes.
Do you have questions or thoughts?
Sorry, I had to unmute. Nope,
Okay.
it all sounds good to me. I don't have any questions.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you for being at the meeting, and we appreciate your attendance.
Yep.
Okay.
Sorry I couldn't be there.
Are there other questions or comments? Or Steve, do you have anything further?
No.
Juan?
Not on this topic, just on to the next topics.
Okay, the next topic is somewhat related. Isn't it?
It kind of is, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah. So let's just leave it at this. I think that we should plan to on the 16th, perhaps. We should plan to go ahead and do this kind of review with the full board. Maybe not in quite the amount of detail, but cut down just a little bit and with good exhibits so that they can see that. And I think it's very useful to have this kind of conversation with the full board with no action to be taken. So let's move along then from an information item to the unassigned fund balance transfer that's being requested, which is an item which we would be deciding whether we're going to recommend it to the full board. Okay.
yeah, so this is pretty standard fare. We do this most years, as you saw from the previous presentation. In 2020, 21, the audited financial reports showed that operating fund had revenues over expenses of approximately $1,035,000 with an unassigned fund balance of 48%, meaning that the 21-22 general fund, 21-22% of the general fund balance. So when the capital program started, the intention of the board was to have the unassigned fund balance be closer to 2% for future expenses. Back before, it was always 50% or more is what we wanted for future expenses. It's been the practice of the board to transfer revenues over expenses from the operating fund to the capital project fund to keep the annual fund balance more accurate and help fund the capital and other one-time expenses. So staff is recommending a motion to the full board to amend the original budget with a transfer of $1,035,000 from the unassigned fund balance of the operating fund to the capital projects fund. Is that's the right wording, right, Juan?
Yes.
Okay, got to make sure that it's work for the
Yes.
accountants.
Yeah. So moved.
All right, it's been moved and seconded. Are there questions of our staff about this request? Pretty well understand, I guess, from the presentation, why we're asking this, and it seems like the right thing to do. So I will, unless there are any questions, I will ask all those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed? Okay, hearing no opposition, the matter is approved, and we will report that to the board on the next regular meeting, the 16th. Is that correct?
I think that's right.
Okay. Is there other business?
Let's see, we had, Teresa, there was no public comment for this meeting, correct?
No.
Okay, and so next up would be to go into closed session to discuss items. Actually, there's two items. One of them involves a potential legal issue, and the other involves sale of property, sale of purchase property.
I make a motion, we go into closed session as permitted under the Missouri law 610.021 for real estate and legal purposes.
Is there a second?
Second,
Okay, it's been seconded. All those in favor of going into closed session, please say aye.
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 Those opposed? Those abstaining? Thank you very much. We will now go into closed session. I think we have to